Hi, Misha here, and for no reason at all, I felt like talking about the German Luger, the Pistole.08, the P08, the Parabellum. I don't know why, I just felt like talking about it. I have my same guns here, plus a few more I'll show you in the video. I've got a couple of examples from Switzerland, early and late, a couple of German examples, pretty early-ish and late-ish. And then, of course, my kind of favorite, the good old-fashioned Finnish mutt. Hey, it's a lot of history. Just thought I'd talk about them. Again, no real purpose. And full disclosure, I'm not a Luger expert, very far from it. But, you know, I cover Walther guns so often here, and Makarovs and what have you. I don't know, kind of felt like I was doing the good old Luger a disservice. Because no matter what, this is a very historic gun. So let's hang out and talk about it. And if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, check out the link to the Patreon. With that, let's just, dive in, and I'll ramble on for a bit. Well, where else to begin but the beginning, which is not actually with the Parabellum, the Luger. It actually started with Hugo Borchard, who had several inventions but very little success. And I suppose his most famous pistol is the C93, which was produced by Luger. Anyway, I'm tired. In the 1890s. So before we can talk about the Luger, let's talk about the C93 Borshard. You didn't actually think I had one, did you? Even though they made roughly 3,000, that was a long time ago, and very few survive today. A friend actually had one once, and it sold for ridiculous money, as in enough money to buy 2 economy cars or 1 nice car. Now, this is my oldest example. This is my Swiss 1906 model. Now, the Borchard was advanced for its day and time. Really, it was the first mass-produced self-loading pistol. It fired a 30 caliber round, 7.65, and this would later evolve into 7.63 Mauser, and was very similar to what Mannlicher and Steyr were using. But it would be Georg Luger who would kind of meet up with him. Now, Luger was frankly more successful. He worked with Mannlicher in the 1880s on some self-loading designs, and then he would begin working at Luger in 1891. And in 1894, he would be sent to the USA to show off Luger's new self-loading pistol to the U.S. Navy, who was getting ready to do trials. And actually there would be the 1895 Lee Navy Winchester that I've actually showed you before. This would actually be the C93 Borshard. And through this and other events, Borchard and Luger became quite close friends, and their families became friends. And so they kind of worked on the design together. Well, they tried. See, Luger became DWM at the beginning of 1897, and several countries had looked at the C93, but there were no takers. It was big, it was bulky, it needed refinement. Unfortunately, Borchard was not willing to do it. So after they kind of nagged him for years, they gave up and assigned Georg Luger to do it. And of course, he was intimately familiar with the design. So in 1898, he filed his first patents for what was known at the time as the Borchard Luger pistol. And he would use the same basic system, like later Lugers. It uses that kind of bending toggle lock that we're all familiar with. And it would fire the 7.65 by 21, later known as 7.65 Parabellum cartridge. Single action, 8-round mag. But really where he's excelled, for one thing, he shortened the barrel. Now, Lugers have been offered in different barrel lengths, but the Borchard had a pretty long barrel. He also went to a more angled swept back grip, And he relocated the recoil mechanism into the grip, originally using kind of a two-piece leaf spring. The Borchard actually had the recoil system in a separate housing, which made it very bulky. And he did a few other things like changing up the trigger plate over here, moving the lanyard to the back, things of that nature. And yeah, this would really be the first production model for the new DWM. And it just so happens that beginning in 1897, the Swiss Army started to get in the market for a replacement for the 1882 Ordnance revolver, and they were really thinking automatics. So that's how we ended up with this pistol. Well, okay, the one right before it, the Model 1900. The first Swiss trials were in November and December of 1898, but then they kind of broke for the winter and would resume in May of 1899. They would test the Borshard Luger. This was kind of a transitional pistol, integrating some of Luger's improvements, but still some more Borchard things. It would go up against the earlier version of the C96, an entry from Roth, an entry from Mannlicher, an entry from Bergman, all these things. And the Swiss really quickly decided that the Borchard Luger was the most reliable. It was one of the lighter guns. It just had the most promise. But they did have some suggestions. They really wanted to continue to lighten it up. They wanted, eventually they would go away from the stock lug. That would be something that would kind of go back and forth. And they would integrate and improve the grip safety system. They would refine the magazine a bit. They would improve the controls, making the safety, the takedown a little larger, things of that nature. And in May of 1900, the Swiss would try out this kind of second version, and it would be tested against a new entry from Mauser, an improved C96, and a few other things. And again, it was kind of found to be the winner. So in April of 1901, the Swiss government officially selected the Parabellum pistol, as it was known, commonly we would call it the Luger, as its next service sidearm, making it the first military to really adopt a self-loading pistol. And the Swiss version had a 4.7-inch, 120 millimeter barrel, fired 7.65 Parabellum. It actually has a reverse safety from later guns, up being safe, down being that's safe, that's fire. Again, grip safety. We do have a lanyard loop, but we do not have a stock lug, wood grips. And the original 1900 pattern had those kind of dished in cocking toggles, and it used the old flat spring system and a few other changes. The Swiss would initially order 3,000 of these. They would all be produced by DWM, and ultimately they would acquire about 5,100 of the Model 1900. And this would be the first version that would be sold commercially of the Luger by DWM. And it would gain a lot of attention in 1901. The German government, the German military would try it out. The U.S. military would try it out. The German military liked it. They thought it was quite accurate, quite reliable. They liked the lightweight, but they were concerned about its complication. Remember, they were coming from the old Reichs revolver. If anything, that's simple. And the U.S. was a little more about it. And the grip safety was kind of a controversial point. In fact, the first time we know the Germans used these in combat was in East Africa around 1905, and the grip safety was something they complained about quite a bit. So I'll explain why they actually deleted it. Another thing, they weren't really fond of the 30 caliber, the 7.65 Parabellum round. I thought it was a little less oomphy. So DWM would introduce the Model 1902. More importantly, the Model 1902 was the first to be chambered for 9x19 Parabellum, which was really just a necked up cartridge. And this would quickly lead to the transitional Model 1903 pistol. Still, the U.S. was not going to take it. We know that from history. And the Swiss had already went with the 1900. The German army would continue to hold off. Actually, the first to adopt it would be the German Navy. And I have some older footage of a German Navy pistol for you to look at. So let's cut to me from the past. The German Navy would be the first organization, first part of the military to adopt a version of the Luger, known as the Marine pistol, or Pistole.04. It was first adopted in 1904, and an initial order of 8,000 were placed. Now, that would be the earlier 1900 style with the leaf spring, and when the coil spring came along in 1906, as well as the updated cocking, that would get integrated into the P04 design. And there would be another 23,000 built between 1906 and 1917 in various small contracts. So what makes a P04 or Marine pistol? Well, they were in 9x19 Parabellum, really one of the very first. They had a 5.9-inch barrel, so relatively long. They could be fitted with a shoulder stock, and they had quite an interesting rear sight. It was adjustable with two positions. I'll set you down. Just kind of sliding it back. .200 when it was pulled back, and pressing it forward would get us back to the essentially default 100 position here. So not a large number, around 31,000 before and during the First World War. Afterwards, the German Navy would go to using standard 3.9-inch Parabellums, Lugers. Still, of course, single action only, standard 8-round magazine. And these were manufactured, as far as I know, exclusively by DWM. The first contract of P04 Navy Lugers actually had a grip safety, very similar to what we find on the Swiss 1906 here. In fact, the two have a good deal in common, including having longer barrels. Of course, the Navy is still longer and has the adjustable rear sight, whereas this does not. But I thought I'd bring it out to point out that your first 8,000 or so would be grip safety, and then the next 20 some odd thousand would be more standard frame. Again, early days. As for the Army, here's my wartime gun. Some of you may not have seen this one pistol. Picked it up a couple of years ago. It's been on my personal channel. Anyway, the Navy would adopt it, the Army would hold off. 1906 would be a big year. DWM would introduce the new model, and that's really what we're familiar with here. It replaced the flat spring system with a coil spring. This did require some redesign. They went to a new, larger, more aggressive extractor. That's good. They went to the new toggle system with the checker DOMs we know. They got rid of some needlessly complicated systems like the anti-bounce. And actually would be the Swiss, they would adopt it. It would be the model 1906 in Switzerland. And that's what this is here. The Swiss would ultimately acquire 33,000 of these, and up until 1918, give or take, they were made in Germany for them, but then they would switch to production at Berne for the last few years. And yeah, this is the model most people are familiar with, and really with the Luger kind of hit its final design. The Swiss would continue to use 30 caliber, but other militaries like Germany would prefer the 9mm. Also in 1906, I should say that Georg Luger was sick, and Mauser asked for the Army to push back testing and trials so they could come up with a new pistol model, which they did. So trials would resume in 1907, and again the Luger was kind of seen as the best, especially the new model here. It addressed a lot of issues and was a little bit cheaper, simpler, kind of addressing some of the concerns the Germans had. And it was officially adopted in August of 1908, and an order was placed with TWM for 50,000, pretty much just like this. They would have, well, some sources say 3.9 inch, some say 4 inch barrels, some say 100 millimeters, some say 102. It gives you an idea. Now, they would ask them to get rid of the grip safety, and they would actually ask them to add a lug for a shoulder stock. There was never an intention to issue a stock with the shorter barrel guns, but like the Navy gun, they wanted to have basically the same frames for all different types, because they already were starting to practice and experiment with carbine versions too. Also part of this deal was it would allow the German government to produce these at state arsenals. For example, Erfurt would tool up and begin production in 1910. The ultimate goal was to purchase 170,000, of course, with World War I eventually, and they would acquire many more than that. But yeah, there were a few updates to the pistol after its adoption, but not many, and most of them were retroactively fitted to older guns anyway. So yeah, it was pretty much a solidified design. Here's that safety. Like I said, it's actually reverse compared to the Swiss version. Same toggle system, slightly different wood grips, fixed sights. But as I said, they had already started kind of thinking about a long barrel version for the Army, and so again, let's cut back to some old footage of me from the past to talk about the so-called artillery Luger. After the adoption of the standard pistol, 1908, P08, attention would return to the concept of a pistol carbine. Now, the German Army first tested some essentially stocked pistols as far back as 1907. These would be the original C93, as well as the C96, the broom handle, and a handful of others, but nothing really came of it. After the adoption of the P08, work would kind of start up again at EWM to try to work on a longer version of the pistol for artillery crews and other support crews that really couldn't reasonably carry a Mauser, even a carbine. And between 1912 and 1913, 50 prototypes for testing were made. And on July 2nd, 1913, the Kaiser signed an order authorizing the adoption of this here, the Lange pistol 1908, or LP08, commonly called the artillery Luger. The Navy had the 5.9 inch barrel. This took it a step further, going to a 7.9 inch barrel, so 8 inches. It also had a new adjustable rear sight. The Navy had a 2-position, 100 and 200 meters. This took it a step further, going to an 8-position rear sight out to 800 meters, so 100 to 800. And the sight even drifts slightly to the left as you adjust it up to try to compensate for torque and rotation. Kind of thoughtful. And originally, the front sights were also adjustable, at least more so than drift. But during World War I, around 1917, this feature was removed just to make things simpler. So essentially, it was the same as a Pistole.08, except it had a much longer barrel. Even though these were intended for artillery, they ended up actually being used quite a bit by the Air Corps in airplanes before machine guns were attached, and in Zeppelins. And then during trench warfare, Stormtruppen started using these, assault troops, storm troops, because it was kind of in between. Keep in mind, 1915, 1916, there was not a submachine gun. So this is kind of the next best thing. They did experiment with the select fire version, as did they do with the C96, but that was not very successful, to say the least. DWM would manufacture these between 1914 and 1918, and the Erfurt Arsenal, the state-owned arsenal, would build the LP-08 exclusively in 1914. And there is, of course, one famous accessory as well. During the Great War, the Trommel magazine, the snail drum, was introduced. Yes, this was used in the MP-18 submachine gun, the Bergmann, but it was originally made for use in the artillery Luger, the LP-08. It holds 32 rounds, single stack, single feed, well, at least at the top, and curls around itself. Had a special pouch, very awkward shape if I'm being honest, and because it was really difficult to load fully, rather ornate loader was an essential piece of kit. Now, because of everything, typically only one of these would be issued per gun, but they could still feed from standard 8-round magazines too. So that was kind of the initial effort, and again, the snail drum would be the first submachine gun magazine that Imperial Germany would use besides. And of course, these would be issued with the bored holster shoulder stock, and were expected to be fired with it. Production would end by 1918, and actually the LP-08 was banned by treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, in 1919, because apparently it was just that big of a threat. And just for a fun comparison of barrel lengths, here we have the standard P08 3.9-inch barrel, the P04 Navy with the 5.9-inch, and of course the LP08 with the 7.9-inch. So it's really the difference, sights and barrel. The rest of the guns are the same, and all do have lugs for shoulder stock, although only the artillery and most of the navies would have them. Typically your standard P08 would not. And one more comparison shot. Why not? You can see what they're going for. For standard use, a 4-inch barrel is fine. For shipboard use, you can understand why having a longer barrel and a little more long-range sight would be useful. Pushing this out to an 8-inch barrel, interestingly, this is basically a submachine gun length barrel. Many of your early submachine guns had roughly an 8-inch barrel, and the sight going out to 800 meters is, shall we say, optimistic. But it was early days, and they were still trying to figure out what really worked. So, neat in my opinion. What do you think? Let's move on. When the war kicked off in 1914, the German military was still rearming, really re-equipping with the Pistole.08, and they did not have near enough, not to mention LP-08s. They had very few of those because they had just been adopted. so production had to be ramped up. Between 1908 and 1918, DWM produced around 1 million, a little more. And between 1910 and 1918, Erfurt produced a little over 500,000. It's estimated that, kind of including previous variants, previous smaller contracts like the navies and all that, Germany had upwards of 2 million, certainly over 1.5 million during World War I. But that's why we also see other pistols in use, for example, the Walther Model 4 and the Mauser Model 1914 that we've talked about in previous videos. Of course, when the war ended, the Treaty of Versailles completely banned pistols with stocks, and it banned pistols with barrels over 4 inches. And it also banned calibers over 8 millimeter. And on top of that, it only allowed for Germany, the Weimar Republic, to have a military of 100,000, and they could only have 50,000 pistols. So, yeah. And then on top of all that, while DWM continued to operate, they were for commercial sales. The only one allowed to sell to the military was Simpson, who got up and running in the early 1920s and essentially took the tooling from the old Erfurt arsenal. And so from 1922 to 1932, they had the exclusive contract to supply the military needs of the Weimar Republic. They wouldn't build a whole lot at Simpson, like 25,000, 30,000, and they would mostly build them from existing parts. And guns that were integrated into the new military would have the double date stamp over the chamber. You'll see like 1920 and then a date. You'll even see sometimes it'll say 1920-21, although a lot of times you see 1918, 1920. That was a property mark to let them know that it was legitimate, because a lot of people took their pistols home illegally, and they were trying to kind of prevent that. So that's what Simpson did. These would actually be 98 millimeter barrel guns, and mostly in 7.65 Parabellum, although some 9mm kind of crept in too. They played a little sneaky. And so that's about a 3.85 inch barrel, so just slightly shorter to comply with the treaty. But DWM, after a few years of kind of financial iffiness, started to find some success around 1923. And for this talk, let's bring out my Finnish Pistole.08 or M08, because this started life off as a Pistole 1923 M23. The model 1923 was DWM's export model, and they offered it in several barrel lengths, anywhere from 75 millimeters up to 600 millimeters. And while most were in 7.65, some were in 9 millimeter. And yeah, they would be very successful, at least relatively speaking. Stoger would be the major importer into the USA, although of all things, Abercrombie and Fitch would actually import some too. And this would be when the Luger name would start to be used and kind of become famous in America, although Parabellum was still the accepted name in Europe. And you would see several models sold here, different types, typically with wood grips. Now this one looks a little different. In 1923, DWM had a nice contract for Finland to supply 8,000 to the new, young Finnish military. When they started off, they were pretty standard 3.9 inch barrel, 7.65 guns, wood grips. But as time went on, and as they adopted new guns, they would replace with their own barrels that were 5 inches long, made by Tikka in country and 9mm. They would give a kind of a phosphate finish to the metal, and as the wood grips broke in service, they would eventually replace them with synthetic, because these stayed in service a really long time. And this is a honest to God Mixmaster Luger, but I think it's cool because it has a lot of history, and a lot of Lugers saw that. They were popular in China during the Civil War, the warlord stage there in the 1920s, and they were used heavily during the Japanese occupation in the 1930s. They would even make it to places like Vietnam. They would be throughout Africa. They just spread out, you know. And they continued to be the main standard issue sidearm for Germany throughout the Weimar era and into the Nazi period. You know, after the new model 1906, mechanically, very, very little changed. I mean, yeah, the Swiss guns had the grip safety, some had stock lugs, some didn't, but pretty much the same. So for that, we'll use the Finnish example here. You know the Luger, probably some of you better than I do. We don't really have a grip safety on this one. We don't have a magazine disconnect. We just have a old-fashioned toggle safety. It's of course single action only, and it has the very famous elbow looking system. It is cool, I'll give it that. You don't have to really worry about a slide coming back on you. Upward ejection, last round hold open. What we kind of think of today as a Browning style release, push button. 8-round mag. This is a later style mag with a polymer base and whatnot. Earlier ones could be wood, and then transitional ones were kind of an alloy. Notice it does stay open on the last round, even without a mag in. There's no release, of course. You just goes forward. No exposed hammer, internal hammer, and a reasonably good but not amazing trigger. But it is a wide trigger. The thing that even since I was a kid, and I think that really impresses a lot of people about the Luger, is the just intuitive grip angle. This is a very ergonomic gun, especially considering its age. It just simply points naturally, and the barrel is fixed to the frame so it's not tipping or tilting. You have a very, very long sight radius, all things considered. And it just looks, it has a look to it. It's different. And of course that's why it's become instantly recognizable, iconic, and famous. Again, probably more of you know more about it than I do. It's kind of one of those guns that back in the day, every gun shop had one of these or a couple in. Now, they're usually just mixed masters or, you know, maybe 1920s commercial guns. But they had them. Nowadays, they've kind of disappeared, unfortunately. But that's the nature of surplus. And at one time, the Swiss guns weren't really sought after, but that's changed as well. And, you know, a lot of Luger collectors look down at mixed masters like this one or your East German reworks. As long as they were mixed up and reworked and refinished in the service, I love it. Because that's a history. The exact same reason I still like the Russian capture K98s, you know? Real history there. As beautiful as the Swiss Lugers are, you know, the history there is relatively limited. You have to kind of appreciate them for their engineering. But, you know, the wartime guns certainly saw things. So, yeah, just thought I would talk about it. Again, there are far better people and better videos that can get into the mechanics of these things out there. So, I'll kind of quit rambling on and get back to whatever it was I was doing. So now let's bring out my Mauser, so-called Black Widow from World War II. Mauser would kind of slowly take over in the late 20s. DWM had some problems. Some investors pulled out. The original Luger investor part that integrated in would pull out. in 1929, and so they would end firearms production, and Mauser would end up with the parts and start assembling them using DWM components, even some with DWM markings. In May of 1930, a lot of machines and even personnel were transferred from Berlin to Oberndorf, where Mauser was at, and they would assemble guns nominally under the DWM name using their marked parts. In 1932, like I said, the Simson contract would be canceled, and in 1933, the new Nazi government would shut the factory down and seize their assets because they were run by a Jewish family. And since the tooling originally came from Erfurt, they claimed it was state property and seized it. Eventually, it would be bought by, well, the Nazi good old boy network for the Luftwaffe in a way, becoming Krieghoff, and yeah, it's a whole thing. Mauser would actually start assembling new pistols in 1934 under the secret code of S, and this would quickly become S42, and they would use dates K for 1934 and G for 1935. Krieghoff would not start assembling until 1935, and they would somewhat confusingly use S as that year's date code. However, by 1936, they kind of quit caring, and so they just started putting the year marking on them at Mauser. And by this point, sometimes the S would disappear, and you would just see 42 as a code, and this would progress on. In 1937, Mauser would try to simplify production, going from rust bluing with Strad parts to just kind of a more standard salt blue, more matte blue, and trying to keep production down because these pistols were kind of expensive to make by those standards. So you started to see some shortcuts made, and some efforts had been taken to replace the Pistole.08 going back to the late 20s, but of course in 1938 the Walther P38 would be adopted to replace it, but it would take time to go into full production, really not till 1940 or even 41 for large scale. So the Luger would continue on at Mauser in pretty large numbers, and Krieghoff in small numbers. In 1940, pretty much all production was dedicated to the government. Commercial sales were more or less ended. In 1941, these black synthetic grips would appear, and the code BYF would appear. And while the government wanted Mauser to switch over to P38 production earlier, the people at Mauser, Oberndorf, resisted, but finally in September of 1942 they acquiesced and started changing over to the P38. But they still put together some P08s, and the last shipment was given to the Wehrmacht, to the government at least, in November of 1943, and after that time the government inspectors refused to accept more guns. The funny thing is, Mauser still had plenty of parts, so they actually assembled 4,000 at the end of that year and sold them to Portugal. And in Portugal, they were known as the M943. Even after these guns were all put together, Mauser still had tons of parts, but no buyers. And Krieghoff would continue to make them in small batches through 1944, and go on and so forth. But this is a pretty late gun, made under the Nazi time. And you can see, even then, mechanically, there's really no changes. Probably the biggest changes is the way they made the magazines. They went to kind of an extruded metal type. And even though this was officially replaced by the P38, it was still very common within Germany all the way to the end of the war. And even then, the story was far from over, frankly. Let's bring our final Luger out and also revisit Switzerland. This is the 1929 model, sometimes called the 0629 model. And unlike the 1900, which was entirely built in Germany, and the 1906, sometimes also called the 1906-24, which was partially built in Germany, partially in Switzerland by Berne, the 1929 was designed in Switzerland and assembled and built in Switzerland at Berne. And it was an improved and also simplified version not unlike they were doing with the so-called Black Widows at Mauser. They did eliminate a good number of the strawed parts and kind of fancy blue parts. They also simplified a lot of the controls. You'll notice the cocking knobs are smooth. The safety, while it is a little larger, lost its checkering. The takedown lost its checkering. The mag catch lost its. We went to synthetic grips. This one's black, at least I think so. They also did them in kind of red and brown. And they did make the grip safety even bigger than it was on the model 06 here. Quite a bit bigger. No stock lug, and still has standard fixed sights. Oh, no lanyard loop either. These are just kind of the last of the militaries. It's still chambered for 7.65, yada yada. And they would build about 27,900, with the last ones coming out around 1947, 1948. Some sources say 1949, basically until the P-49 came along. Which makes sense, but of course these, along with the older versions, would serve in Switzerland for decades. And, they would be sold commercially, but they wouldn't be exported to military users. And, of course, Switzerland would remain neutral, because that's kind of what Switzerland does. These are very well made, but they do lack a little bit of the elegance of the older ones, I have to admit. So now let's talk about other post-war. Of course, 1945 and onwards, lots of pre-war and wartime guns were still knocking about. Estimates, Mauser built around 1 million between 1930 and 1943, give or take. Krieghoff, like I said, they were never really that important. They built under 14,000, maybe closer even to 13,000. It was actually a pretty inefficient outfit, if I'm being honest. Again, Simson, maybe 25,000. So yeah, Mauser's the big producer. And then, of course, you have the Swiss guns, but even they didn't have huge numbers themselves. And so some were just, reissued. For example, Soviet Russia captured thousands upon thousands of them during the war, and they would refurbish some and stick them in long-term storage. Some they would give to allies, but they wouldn't reissue within the Red Army. Just kind of stuck them back for a rainy day that thankfully never came, because it would have been a nuclear rain. And East Germany reissued, like to the Vopo, the Stasi, others, Lugers, well into the 50s and 60s. Most were just repurposed wartime guns, but they did assemble a few over the years from existing parts, things like that. But of course, one of the most noteworthy production runs started in June of 1945. We've talked about the Grey Ghost P-38s. The French occupied and controlled the Mauser Obendorf factory, and they started up Luger production in 1945. Like I told you earlier, Mauser had a lot of parts, so they had enough to build, and they cranked out around 3,500. So not a tiny number, not huge. They also might have refurbished some, and they did make new magazines. And these would go to police, especially police that were occupying Germany. And some would be given to the French military, namely the Foreign Legion. And when the Soviets kicked up enough of a fuss in 1946 and the French had to kind of knock it off, some of the tooling and workers were transferred to the MAC factory in France and would continue to assemble a few guns there, and heck, might have worked on future projects, for French pistols. I think that's kind of neat. And so that's how a lot of Lugers ended up in Vietnam. They were taken over there by the French Foreign Legion. And of course, many more had been exported to America in the 20s and 30s through Stoger and others. And as the Swiss guns were surplused out in favor of the P-49, they would kind of make their way here and there. And again, places like Inner Arms would import these Finnish Lugers. A lot of them didn't survive because they were used heavy, but some made it into the country too. A lot of the Russian captures came over as well. By the 1960s, you'd think that'd be kind of the end of the Luger. But actually, no. A new Mauser company would open up, again in Oberndorf. And in 1969, they would announce they were producing Lugers again. They had actually purchased the production line from Switzerland. That was over at Berne, because they were no longer using it. This is why a lot of the early ones had the grip safeties, because they were that pattern. And they would build them for the commercial market, doing a lot of commemorative guns, some carbines, different variations throughout the 70s and into the mid-80s. And while they officially ceased production in 1986, they would still turn out a handful of guns using existing parts into the 1990s and, into the age of reunification. So production lasted almost a full 100 years. And meaning there's over 3 million in the world today. So, yeah, kind of an interesting, I guess you'd call it a coda to that story, little thing. And a lot of these would stay in military inventories, like, say, in France, into the early 70s. And again, East Germany would issue them for a while. They just knocked about, They weren't cutting edge, but much like the 1911, the Luger, the Parabellum, was ahead of its time. And just for another comparison, here's the artillery Luger compared with a C96 broom handle Mauser, or rather my Chinese detaching mag version in 9mm. Still a shorter barrel. Still has the crazy long-range rear sight though. Like I said, back in 1907, 1908, even up through 1912, these two did compete before the LP08 was formally adopted. But of course, the broom handle would actually go on to be produced after the Great War, and the LP08 would not. So there is that to consider. And really, guys, that's about it. I just felt like talking about this. No particular reason. No new gun to show you. It was just on my mind. I couldn't tell you why. Realized I had not done a Luger video in a while. So thought I'd show you my 5 examples here. 2 Swiss, 2 German, and a Finnish mutt. And a couple of old clips of the artillery and navy patterns that a friend had. Even though they're scrubbed guns and rebuilds, at least they show you the sights and the barrels and gives you a good idea of what it looks like. So yeah, that's really about it. Let me know what you think. As you could, please do like, share, and subscribe, and do feel free to comment. And if you could, please check out the link to the Patreon page. Maybe then Hobo will stop meowing. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.